Hi Dave, thanks a lot for taking time and talking to us today.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So, before we can move forward, can I ask you to introduce yourself, the body of work that you have done, and how all of that has kind of conspired for us having this conversation today?
Well, you might need to help me with that, but my name is Dave Gray. I'm a entrepreneur and an artist. I started as a journalist doing information graphics for newspapers, and then I started a company called Explain, focused on explaining complex and potentially confusing business topics visually. And I pretty much have, pursued that path. That I suppose that it's really focused. My focus has been on creativity in creating businesses, but also creativity in creating a life. And I think it's many entrepreneurs are driven by different things. But for me, it was very much about creating the life that I wanted to lead. So I guess how that came to be of interest to you, I cannot answer. You will have to answer that for me.
Yeah, I'll answer that. So I was actually looking at probably in last year. I was in Singapore and I was talking to a couple of friends of mine, and I'm a design thinking coach, and I was asking someone, as to know if there is any interesting book that I should read, and game storming came up, and they said that this is a book that you should definitely read, because I do facilitate a lot of workshops, and that's how I kind of liked and started following the kind of work that you do. And then I reached out to you, I think if I'm not wrong, in September of last year, asking if we can do a conversation around your new book, which was Liminal Thinking, which was about to come out at that point in time, and you responded, and kind of that's how this entire thing happened. We just found time now. It's like almost 5 months after we connected.
Wonderful.
Yeah. So maybe if you can let me know the entire idea of game storming. So where did that come from? I think you also collaborated with a couple of other co-authors on that. So how was that experience like?
Well, game storming came out of so I had been working in the newspaper business for about 10 years doing information design, information graphics, and I started my company because it became clear that the newspaper business was not the business of the future. And I had found this, I guess what I would call this art form that I really love to do, which is the art of visual explanation, explaining things visually. And so I felt there was going to be a need for this, regardless of whether people were reading newspapers or not, that people would still have things that they wanted to get up to speed on quickly, and they would still enjoy looking at pictures and visual explanations. And so that was the first step, was starting a company. And how this became game storming was I discovered, as one of the first problems you have in any business that's successful is trying to scale it. And we had reached a point in the company where I was somewhat trapped. I was the only person who was able to do this thing that, we had plenty of people who could do the illustration work, but we needed a way to scale this ability that I had to interview people and groups and synthesize the knowledge from the group into a sketch, a very high-level visual architecture. And so game storming came out of that. It was a way to systematize and scale this consulting activity that prior to game storming had been very intuitive and self-directed. There's a phrase that I used for many years and still use whenever it's appropriate, which is the idea of turn your magic into science. And it comes from a quote, I think by Arthur C. Clarke, who said that any sufficiently advanced science looks like magic. So if you don't understand the science, it looks like magic. But all magic can be turned into science. So the idea behind game game streaming was there's a lot of things, and it's games. The idea behind game streaming and almost any technology, there are a lot of things that people have mastered that they have the ability to do that looks seamless and it looks like magic. And if you can find a way to take your magic as a practitioner of anything and translate that into science, and in other words, turn it into recipes or other things that can make that magic repeatable and learnable, then you can scale things in a way that feels magical in itself. So game streaming started out as a slide deck. Okay, was started by me kind of trying to take a position behind myself and observe what I was actually doing and trying to deconstruct it, which is not easy, as you can imagine. But trying to deconstruct, okay, why did I do that? Why did I ask that question at this moment? Why did I insist that we have the room set up in this way, etc.? And it began that way, and then it started becoming a collection. There's a lot of other people who are doing similar things. And it started out as this kind of mission to turn that magic of what we call the whiteboard session or a visualization session into some kind of a science. And we started collecting our own ideas, but also a lot of ideas from other people that we met over the years, and fellow practitioners. And it became this, I guess you could call it a recipe book of design techniques that we now call game streaming.
Interesting. And how was the collaboration with the other two co-authors came about? Writing a book by yourself is a difficult process in itself, and to write a book with two other co-authors, I don't know how it transpires or how easy or difficult it is. Because I have written one book, and right now in the middle of the second book, and I know that it is a painful process to go through, writing the entire book. So how was that entire experience working with the other two authors?
Well, game streaming is like a cookbook, so I knew that there was, there was a lot of work involved. There were 83 games, I believe. There's now over 150. It was going to take a lot of work, so it had a lot to do with how we divided up the labor. Well, the way we did it was I wrote the front matter, the sort of the introduction and the theory and the explanation, and then James and Sonny I recruited to do all the recipes. So we took all the recipes and split them into. We gave half to Sonny and half to James, and so I think it was very successful because we divided the labor and we had a very specific kind of structure for all of the recipes. And Sonny, I believe, ended up drawing all of the diagrams so we would have a consistent look and feel to all of that stuff. But yeah, it was divide and conquer.
Interesting. And if you have to think back the entire process of game storming, and if you have to pick up 1, 2, or 3, maybe tools or games that you've put in that book, which have probably had the maximum impact in all your interactions with your customers, with your clients, with all the kind of feedback that you've got, what would those 1, 2, or 3 games be?
Well, there's a section in the book called Core Games. So we did actually divide those out in the book. Let me pull out my copy here. So there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, about 10 core games that we pulled out. One of the ones that I use all the time is I use all of these all the time, but the empathy map is one that I use an awful lot. That's and it's become quite popular. That's a game that is all about trying to very quickly with a group create some empathy for the target audience of whatever they're working on, or the target user or the customer. It's a nice, very simple and lightweight way to get everybody kind of on the same page about who this is for, or why we should care, or what we're doing, why we're doing this.
Interesting. Do you have any interesting anecdote about when you use this tool, and if something interesting or something funny came about, or something something interesting that came about when you tried to use this with a particular group.
Yeah, I do remember one time I was in a workshop and I asked people to do this empathy mapping exercise around someone they were really having a difficult time with or having conflict with at work. And the group went from, I asked sort of after the exercise was over, I asked what there were any insights, and the one of the people in the group said, yeah, I really hate this woman. And as I was going through the empathy process, I really started to understand where she was coming from, and I really feel very differently about her now, and I think I'm going to approach her and talk to her differently now. And I think that happens quite often. That's often happens that people are looking at a person in their world as an obstacle and have not thought through really where that person might be coming from, why they might be acting in certain ways, what are the feelings and emotions and experiences that might be behind that. And by the empathy mapping process takes people through these, sort of like, it asks people to imagine the experience that this person might be having. What kind of things are they seeing in their world? What kind of things do you hear them saying? What might they be hearing from other people? What are they doing? And as you go through that process, you start to see how you start to see the world from that person's perspective a little bit. And by the time you get to asking the questions about what they might be thinking and feeling, you've kind of in a very in a very quick and lightweight way, you have walked a little bit, spent a little time in their shoes, seeing the world from their perspective, and it's a very powerful way to get a group aligned at the beginning of let's say a set of activities around customers or users or readers or something like that.
So that's very interesting because I use this method as well when I'm facilitating workshops. And one thing that always strikes me is that we're all inherently emotional beings, right? And why is it so difficult for someone to actually empathize with someone else? That's, if you ask me, out of all the emotions, of all the things that we as humans inherently need in order to survive in a group, empathy is probably at the highest, and still it's probably the most difficult. Why do you think that is so?
I have no idea.
but you do think that this is the case?
Guess. It's always been difficult for me, and I found that sometimes breaking things down to steps and turning something into an exercise that it's like a checklist can be even a checklist can be very helpful when you have it's like taking, I don't know if you meditate, but sometimes just there are some triggers or things that can get you take 3 deep breaths, and there's simple things that if you remember to do them, they will trigger a whole bunch of other positive effects. And if you don't, then you might not ever miss them, but you might not miss what you're missing.
I know. So tell me how from game storming you moved to liminal thinking, and what was the trigger that actually started you off on that path?
There's an in-between book called The Connected Company. So there's a story, I suppose. So from game storming, which is a very much a toolkit or a recipe book for helping people work in a more agile way, I went almost way up to a very different level of abstraction, looking at a lot of the problems that our customers were solving and what were the things they were really trying to achieve. And a significant percentage of our customers were in some kind of business transformation situation. Often the stuff is now goes by the name of digital transformation. They were involved in figuring out how to deconstruct their company from an industrial age organization and rethink it and reconfigure it as a digital company, for the digital world. And it's like what we're seeing in the world, and I'm sure you're seeing it is that everything that can be digital and anything that can be software put into software is becoming digital, becoming softwareized. I think it was Mark Andreessen who said software is eating the world. Every business in the future is going to be a software business. It's going to be a digital business, and the fact is that digital businesses have a fundamentally different structure than industrial businesses, and it's much easier in a way to be a company that's born digital than to be a company that is born industrial and trying to figure out how to be digital. It's like almost like a dinosaur trying to figure out how to become a mammal. It's a difficult transition, and so I wrote a book called The Connected Company, which was really trying to understand at a very high level what is the digital organization, what does a connected company look like, how is it structured, what is different about it. And I probably don't have time to go into all the details of that right now, but it was it's kind of like trying to imagine and tell the story. We all know the story now of Henry Ford and interchangeable parts and the assembly line and all mass production and all these things. And I was trying to think in 100 years in the future, looking back on today, what would that book look like to describe the digital organization, connected company? So that book I wrote, that book was very well received, and a lot of people in senior management read it, and they would come and I was getting the question, this is very interesting. Now, how do we make this transformation? How do we make this, how do we begin this transformation? And that's what led to liminal thinking, because in most cases, the first and most important transformation was going to be a mental transformation, a psychological transformation from a way of thinking about business to another way of thinking about business, a way of thinking about it that was somewhat linear and orderly and structured, hierarchically structured and organized, to something that was much more agile and adaptive and dynamic. And so that's where the Liminal Thinking book came from. It started out as an exploration of agile approaches in software design, but it quickly expanded into something that was much more about psychological agility and kind of a leadership mindset for a digital economy.
Yeah. So you talk about beliefs and some of the strengths and weaknesses that come from beliefs. You talk about beliefs are models. You talk about beliefs are created, and what that means when it comes to someone wanting to transform himself or herself, and what that belief does. So if you could just maybe talk to us about what do you think is probably one or two things which you have seen that people get stuck in, or that people that if they do that one switch can have the maximum impact in their lives. Because I also understand that each one of us has their own mental models of the world that they live in. They imagine stuff, they kind of what we look at or what we perceive the world, probably it's not the real world at all. I mean, we are now moving into philosophical realm, Hinduism and all those stuff, but in reality that's the case. What the way I perceive the world and the way my son perceives the world or my colleague perceives the world is very, very different. And it is these beliefs which either stop us or actually allow us to grow into something which we want to. So in all your research, what is that one or two things that you found are probably the most fundamental and can have the most transformative power when done well?
Okay, I'll give you two. One is travel. I mean, simply find ways to get outside your culture and immerse yourself in another culture. Travel the world. Spend some time in a city where you don't speak the language and you don't understand the culture. Feel your way through figuring that out. If you're unable to travel for whatever reason, try and find news or other sources of information that are radically different than your own. Try and find ways of perceiving the world that might be opposite. If you're Like, for example, if you're in India, so read the Pakistani news, read the opinion pieces in the Pakistan. You're going to find some things that are going to be probably very interesting, right? Very different. Read the opinion pieces of people who have very different opinions than you. So these are all ways of expanding your experience and trying to see the world through other eyes. If you find yourself getting emotional as you are experiencing or reading these things, then you want to ask yourself, what about that emotion? Try and really investigate that emotion. What is it that makes you feel angry or upset or happy when you're reading something? Why is it that you're reacting in the way that you are? These are ways of getting in touch with your beliefs and your perspective, especially how your perspective might be different than others. The other one is simply to turn off your autopilot, because we all, the thing is, if you're trying to create change in the world, you can't change the past. We all know the past is not something that's changeable, and the future doesn't exist yet. So the only time that change is really possible, the only time you can do anything to create change is in the present moment. And yet, often we're not in the present moment. We're physically there, but mentally we are thinking about the future, about that next thing we're going to do, or we're reliving something from our past, or we're daydreaming. And one of the best ways that I've found to bring yourself back into the present moment is simply to turn off your autopilot. You don't have to have a plan, except for not doing what you would typically do. If you think about it this way, if you go to work in the morning, you may have a route that you take every day. You always go the same way to work. That's a routine. That's what I would call an autopilot. And the autopilots can be good because they allow you to focus on other things and daydream and think about other things. But if you really want to focus on what you're doing, take a route that you've never taken before, because simply taking that route that you've never taken before will force you to pay attention and will automatically bring you back in the moment where you can start paying attention to what's really going on around you. And this is really useful when you start to think about the routines and habits that you have in interacting with other people in your life. What you have these autopilot, things. I'll just give you one very tiny example. My wife, one day my wife, Michelle, asked me, she said, "Hey, I'm going to the grocery store. Can I pick anything up for you while I'm there?" And this is a question she asked me pretty often. And the autopilot would be, yeah, okay, I need some, milk or whatever. But at the end of the day, I simply, to just do one simple change, I realized that I had nothing on my calendar for the next hour, and I said, "Can I go with you?" And that flipped the whole day. And you can imagine, she was moved, she was happy. We went to the grocery store together. This is not something that's very strange or difficult to do, but it was definitely not autopilot for our relationship, and it meant a lot to her. I think that you have these micro moments in every day, probably hundreds of thousands of these moments where you can choose to switch off your autopilot and take a different path. And the fact is that every one of those different paths could lead you into magical territory. And there's these doors are around you all the time. The only way that you can bring yourself to notice those doors is to shut off your autopilot.
Interesting. The one thing that I've kind of observed in the little conversation that I've had so far with you is that you have this ability to kind of, sit back and observe what you're doing as a third person. And that's a very critical ability that if we are able to develop, helps us not only in understanding what we are doing, understanding what our belief systems are, but also, as you rightly said, how do you turn magic into science? So why do you think, or how do you think you picked up this ability, and how do you think someone else, if they want to, can pick up this ability?
It's a hard one. It actually takes a practice and focus. I think you can get there, I think, by cultivating a practice. I do think meditation is helpful. And meditation, in a way, is bringing yourself back back to yourself, or in another way, it's also getting out of yourself. It's a little bit of both, I suppose. I think it's also a matter of just creating enough space for yourself to pause and reflect on what's going on in this moment. Get in touch with your own, if you have an emotional feeling or reaction, to take a breath and focus and ask yourself, why is it that I'm feeling? I mean, we've all been in this situation. I'm not angry, right? I mean, where the message and the way that the message is being conveyed are in conflict. And of course, people hear if you hear someone say that, you hear that they are angry, right? They're even angry that someone's saying that they're angry, and and you can I think it's very difficult to take a deep breath in those moments and to ask yourself, what am I? Maybe you are angry, maybe you're not angry. You're feeling something. You're feeling some kind of a strong emotion, and trying to understand and ask yourself, what is that emotion? What am I feeling? Where do I think that might be coming from? I think it's hard. There's more than one level that you can operate on in life, and there's a superficial level where you're not actually asking yourself those deep questions, and then there's a level where you're asking yourself you're really challenging yourself, and I think the second one of those is the one that leads to growth.
Interesting. And I also sense that it is all about slowing down as well, and not just rushing through the day. It's about slowing down, taking those breaths, taking those little pauses, taking those 1 or 2 seconds to reflect. Is that something that you've seen yourself doing quite often? Do you think you are a very calm person and slows things down as well?
I don't know. I do think slowing down is a big part of it, and you can't slow down if you have too much to do. So part of creating the space for yourself to slow down is figuring out. I mean, if you're an entrepreneur, like a lot of your listeners are, you're probably good at creating opportunities, and you can create a lot more opportunities usually than you ever could follow through on. So to create space for yourself to slow down means it's not only a slowing down thing, it's a focus thing. You have to figure out, what are those things I'm going to say no to? What are those 9 things I'm going to say no to, so I can focus on the one thing that I really want to do well? And it's hard when you're an entrepreneur and you want to follow every thread to say no to things. But there's an art to that. It's also that's another one of the more difficult things, is learning to say no.
Yeah. So the other thing that I wanted to explore was, do you think this is something that comes inherently well, or rather, let me rephrase this. Do you think being able to slow down and being able to do this kind of a self-reflection has an impact on the way you express yourself visually? Is there any connection between that?
Would you ask that again?
So the ability to slow down things, and the ability to reflect on what is happening, the ability to be in the moment. Do you think all of these has an impact on how good you are when it comes to visual presentation of information? Being visual.
I think there's a relationship between the two. I don't know which is the source and which is. Maybe they were reciprocal. I do believe that whether it's writing or drawing, some way, cultivating an approach where you are capturing your thoughts and reflecting on the things that you're doing and thinking about them and thinking about how to structure them. The process of writing a book, the process of making a picture of something that's visually complex, is a process of simplification, clarification, refinement, purification. it is a practice of thinking about thinking, reflecting. And I do think for me, I don't know if I was reflecting and then I started drawing, or if I started drawing and realized I was reflecting. It's probably a little bit of both. Those things are intertwined, but I do think there's a relationship there between, you may have a bunch of thoughts, but if you have to sit down and put them into a blog post or an article, you're going to reflect on them. You're going to think a little bit more deeply about them. And if you put that out there and you start reading the comments and reflecting on how other people react to them positively or negatively, that's going to also cause you to reflect on things. So I do think there's definitely a very strong virtual cycle that happens when you're reflecting, writing, visualizing, explaining, and any storyteller will realize that they need to be focused on the people they're telling the story to and how they react, and that's what makes you a better storyteller. But also, it has a lot of also other positive effects, I think.
Interesting. And if I may ask, during this process of writing this book, is there any specific belief that you had held deeply before starting the book, which completely changed while the process of writing this book?
Yeah, I mean, there are several. One, I believe that agile approaches were going to be the future of work. I don't believe that anymore. I believe they're part of it, but not all of it. I think I have beliefs about my relationships that were unchangeable or fixed that have changed. Even the idea that I was actually planning to write the book about changed. It went from being a book about agile and agility to a book about beliefs. So even the book itself, and that was an interesting conversation with a publisher, as you can imagine, going back to him and saying, I can't write the book I promised to write it. I have to write a different book now because of what I'm learning as I'm writing it. So there was a valley of despair in the middle there, where the book that I had planned to write had fallen apart. It had completely disintegrated, and the book that I needed to write had not emerged yet. So it was a rough time.
I can imagine that. And is there anything that anything else that you learned in the process of writing this book that you thought was surprising or interesting?
Just about everything I learned in the process of writing a book was surprising and interesting, and it's
anything that stands out?
Well, the idea that beliefs are created, that they are creative constructions, that we make them, that they don't just happen. To me, that's a very powerful idea, and once you start to think it through and understand it, it's undeniable. But I don't think I had that understanding before I started writing the book. It's a powerful notion, because if you've created the beliefs that you have, you can create different beliefs. You can create them again. You can recreate them. Even beliefs about yourself that are foundational to your identity, that are core to who you think you are, you can rewrite those beliefs. That's a powerful thought, because that gives you the ability to say, I can truly reinvent myself.
Interesting. Reminds me of a book that I had read some time back by Benjamin Sanders and Rosamund Sanders, called The Art of Possibility, in which they call this entire thing as, it's all invented. And if it's all invented, you can invent something new as well. And it's all up to us in our hands. And it's such a simple concept, but yet such a difficult thing to understand. I've spoken about this to so many people. I've spoken about this to myself, and I still find it so difficult to change the the belief systems that I have, when I know that this is something that can be changed. And this is such a powerful concept, as you rightly say. Very interesting. So let's just switch track a little bit and try to understand a little more. I mean, who's the most inspiring person that you've ever met, and why is that person the most inspiring person that you've ever met?
Well, I've never met him, but since we're talking here, I have to mention Gandhi. I mean, of course, I didn't meet the man, but I'm assuming that there's many people in your audience that are from India, so I have to mention him just as probably one of the most inspiring, one of the more inspiring people in history, because he did sort of take a bunch of beliefs and really transform them. And nobody's perfect, of course, but I think that if you just something as simple as making salt, going to the beach and making salt, and it would just sort of toppled an empire. Can you imagine? I mean, just think about that. I mean, how simple that it's simply I think there are tremendous lessons there in mental patterns and like the art of possibility. I mean, really. So in terms of the people that I've met, there was a man named Michael Doyle who was very inspiring to me. He was he's passed away now, but he wrote a book called Making Meetings Work, which was in a way a precursor to game storming. It was written in the 70s, and he was my Obi-Wan, I guess you could say, my mentor. And what was it about him? I think that he had a tremendous ability to be in the moment and to empathize and to be a part of and to create a moment. He was it's hard to describe, but he had a tremendous presence that he brought to everything that he did. In fact, he was going to write the foreword to Game Storming, but he died before I could get him to write it. But he was a tremendous man. I don't know that I can tell you that much about him. I'll give you one anecdote. He showed up in St. Louis to visit me. He lived in San Francisco, and he showed up, and I made some comment about time zones. And you must be feeling, maybe you're feeling a little tired because of the time zone change or something like that. And he looked at me and he said, "I don't do time zones. Wherever I am, that's what time it is for me."
Wow.
What time it is where I am, that's what time it is for me. And I don't know why that struck me. But again, it was, I think, a matter of it was almost mind over matter. He had the ability to be there in a very real way, always. And I think that was something that I took away, and I've always aspired to bring to my interactions with other people, is to find a way to be there with them, to truly be there.
Interesting.
It's very hard to do.
Yeah, it is. It is incredibly hard to do. So, what is something that you see in your world right now, in the world that you occupy, that blows your mind, and that you think, is like fabulous?
Oh, there are things that blow my mind that are not fabulous. Let's see, fabulous. Well, I do think that the changes that are happening in the software and the Internet of Things, I do think there's a tremendous magical possibility. We are now in an age of the world where the biggest limitation to what we can achieve is our own imagination. I mean, it's not gravity, it's not, it's what we can imagine, because almost anything that we can imagine, we can actually make happen. We have this tremendous power at our fingertips, and it's that power is increasing exponentially every day. When in history has the biggest limitation been our imagination? I mean, our imagination has always been way ahead of what's possible, and now we're at an age where our imagination is behind. Our imagination, our creativity is what needs to keep up with the potential. To me, I find that inspiring, and as a creative guy, I find it tremendously exciting. There are things, I mean, just to think about all the things that we can't yet even imagine that are already possible. I mean, and you see it all the time with startups and things, something like, Uber, for example, simply an exercise in deconstructing and reconstructing and recreating and reimagining, and their Airbnb is another one. There's no limit, really.
Interesting. So, if that asks for a follow-up question, do you have any habits or do you have any routines that actually help you in your creative process? And what does your creative process look like?
I create a lot of open space, a lot of downtime for myself to think, to read, to reflect, to zone out. I mean, go for a walk. I intentionally create negative space in my life, open space, white space. So, for example, when I wake up, I will not just reach for the phone and start looking at Facebook right away, but take some time to think about what was going on in my dreams last night, what was happening there, what's going on around me. I think that's probably the most important practice, because the older you get, the busier you get, and the more it really takes an intentional effort to create that open space. Your calendar fills up, and so you've got to block it out. You got to block out, space for thinking.
Interesting. So simple, yet so difficult to do in the lives that we live in.
Yeah.
So maybe let's talk a little bit about what gives you a lot of joy. What are probably one or two fun things that really matter to you, which you really want to do and which you always make time for, which allows you to replenish yourself. Because one of the things that I have seen in a lot of creative people, including myself, is that the entire process of creating something new is it takes a lot from you as a person, and how do you fill that well again is as important as the amount of creativity that comes out of you. Some have this habit of listening to music, some have this ability to go out and play themselves to get so tired, and that actually helps them bring in that or fill in the well of creativity, as you may call it. So what is it that you do for fun which helps you in your creative process?
Well, the creative projects are my fun. In fact, I find if I don't have a project that I'm excited about, I get depressed. So I need that. For me, there's always a creative project happening, and sometimes there's been periods of my life where I've been making paintings. There have been periods of my life where I've been writing a book. There are periods where I'm just drawing. Right now I'm working on these visual explanations. This is my creative joy right now. I mean, creating these pictorial explanations of complex topics. I mean, there's this art form that I love that is called visual explanation, and I also make sure that I make time to read things that are not simply posts or articles on Facebook. I'll read books. Here's an example. I've been reading about Chinese landscape, and one of the ideas in Chinese landscape is that you can a lot of Chinese landscape is almost a playground for the mind, where you've got mountains. They're not necessarily intended to be realistic as much as a thing that you can explore. And so you've got mountains, and you've got a path through the mountains, and you can follow along the path. And that's what this is. I mean, this was inspired by the Chinese landscape. I'm reading about Chinese landscape, but this is a story about conversion on websites. So these are web pages, but they're also mountains. And this is a story, but it's also a mountain path. You can walk along and explore. So a lot of times the space that I make for reading about history or philosophy or ideas creates ripple effects in the other creative acts. So I think there's something very important to me about not just reading what comes across my Facebook stream every day, but actually focusing on what are the things that I'm really curious about and want to learn about and want to know more about, and reading about those things, and kind of actually going and finding the book and reading it.
So that actually begs the next question, which I always ask all my guests is, how do you continue to stay yourself or keep yourself up to date in the field of work that you're doing? What is your way of learning and staying on top of things? I mean, you just said reading stuff that doesn't necessarily come out of your Facebook stream, but is there anything else that you actively do to continue to learn, to continue to evolve as well, apart from reading specific kind of books?
Yeah, I actually have a sort of a timeless approach in the sense that I don't worry about staying on top of things. I focus on, everything that we invent has been invented before. I mean, there's so many lessons from history. When I look to create an amazing visual explanation, right? You can't help but stay current. You can't help but see what's going on around you in the current state, but it takes an effort of will to go look at ancient Chinese landscapes. I mean, I'm looking at Chinese landscapes. I'm looking at hieroglyphics. I'm looking at illuminated manuscripts. This is not. I mean, I don't know if you'd call this staying current. It's like actually, to me, it's not about so much about staying current. You can't help but stay current these days. You're surrounded by the modern moment. What's to me is important is to keep all that stuff anchored in a sense of the context that of everything that has come before, and kind of staying anchored to that. So I don't know. I mean, there is a lot going on, and I think that I've created a life that automatically puts me. I mean, I'm working with large organizations that are always thinking about the future and the next thing. So I don't need to work hard to stay in touch with the moment. What I need to work hard to do is to stay in touch with the past, like the history.
Interesting. So any specific books or any piece of art or thing that you have come across which you would like to recommend to our listeners? So I just saw the book that you showed, which is the illustrated. So what was the book that you showed just now?
The one about the illuminated manuscripts?
Illuminated manuscripts. What is that book?
History of illuminated manuscripts. Yeah, it's a lovely book.
Okay.
Got lots of pictures. I like books with pictures in them.
Yeah, so that looks to be a very interesting book, and I'm sure that's not something that my audience would have ever come across. So that also helps in actually breaking the routine, and trying to read something or trying to find something which is completely out of their world. Maybe it sparks some imagination.
Well, that's kind of what I was saying about experiences. To expand your experience, step into territory that you think you might be interested in exploring. I mean, the library is a wonderful place. It's full of, if you go to a library or a bookstore, you will always bump into things you were not looking for, which is maybe different than what happens when you go to Amazon or you go online. You're going to find these accidental things, and sometimes, give yourself permission to expand the scope of what you're thinking about and the look. I mean, there's amazing things that have been created in the world, and imagine living in India. You're surrounded by thousands of years of history all the time around you. Maybe it's just a matter of taking a minute.
So I think we are kind of nearing the time that we have for this conversation. So I'd like to ask you one question that we always ask all our guests, which is the show is called Pushing Beyond the Obvious. So, what is so obvious to you that people still miss all the time?
I think this is probably a little meta, but I think the fact that the thing that people miss all the time is that their obvious is not so obvious, and that what's obvious to you is not obvious to other people. And you see this in these Facebook arguments that erupt all the time, where some news item comes out and two people have such vastly different interpretations of what is obvious to them that they end up saying about each other, well, this, anyone who doesn't see this obvious must be crazy or insane or idiot or stupid. And the fact is that this is really, if your obvious is creating a world where half of the people in the world that disagree with you or have a different obvious are stupid or crazy, then you're missing something important. Because half the people in the world are not stupid or crazy. And so, the question is, what is it about your obvious that is not obvious to others? And what is it about their obvious that is not obvious to you? And how can you engage in a dialogue and actually truly try to understand where all these obviouses are coming from? And why is it that something that feels obvious to you is not obvious to others? And vice versa.
Interesting. So, one last question before we kind of conclude, which is, if you want, what is one or two things that you want the listeners to go out and do once they finish listening to this conversation, which you think can have a significant impact on their lives?
All right. Well, I'll connect it with another thing, something that I do think is pretty obvious that people miss often, is that business, at its core, business is actually pretty simple. You have three numbers. You have the amount of money that you bring in, you have the amount of money that you spend, and if there's a difference between those, you have a profit. So at the core, business is incredibly simple. Make more money than you spend. There's only a couple ways to do that. You can increase the amount that you make, or you can reduce the amount that you spend. And whether you're a salaried employee or an entrepreneur, these are all true. If you are in debt, you are not saving. You're not profitable. If you're working a day job and you have a salary and you have more money on your credit card than you have in your bank account, then you are not profitable. If you're a business, you go out of business eventually. If you have more in your saving account than you have in your credit card, then you're profitable. This is, to me, a pretty obvious thing that the majority of people in the world are not profitable. Well, that's kind of a problem in the long term, because somebody's going to have to pay that back or not get paid back something that they loaned at the end of the day. What I would say in terms of getting out there and doing things is, I believe that you should not. That one of the biggest, two of the biggest challenges for people, two of the biggest obstacles. One is simply fear. So if you're in doubt about anything, go towards the thing that you fear the most. That's probably the thing that you should be doing. You probably know at some level the fact that you have fear is what's keeping you. If fear is keeping you from doing something, just do it. And then the second thing, which is related, is don't wait till something is finished before you put it out in the world, because the more finished it is, the more precious you're going to feel about it, the less you're going to be able to take feedback and get constructive feedback and incorporate that into it. When you put something out in the world that's simply a really rough sketch or a very rough idea, you're putting it out before you're emotionally attached to it. You can actually listen better to the feedback, and you'll be able to improve it more. So the sooner you can get something, I'm a real big believer in the minimum viable product. The sooner you can get something out into the world, the better. Because the sooner you get it out in the world, the sooner you can start to improve it. So, and I think they're related, because a lot of times the reason you're not putting the thing out in the world is you're afraid of what you might hear, of the feedback you might get. And whether it's a book or a software product or a work of art or whatever it might be, that feedback is not necessarily always feedback that needs to be followed, but it's important to hear it and to understand it and to incorporate it. So get over the fear, get the thing out there. As ugly as your baby might be, get it out there and start getting the feedback on it so you can start making it better.
Super. So thanks a lot, Dave. I think it was a brilliant conversation. I'm sure that people who are listening to this will actually take away a lot of learnings and a lot of interesting stuff for them. So, where can people connect with you?
I'm pretty easy to find. I'm at Dave Gray on Twitter, DAVEGRAY. I'm not sure if that's how. And then I have my website is explainer.com, XPLANER.com, but you can find that from the Twitter as well. I think that's probably how you found me, right?
Yeah, that's right. And the books are the Game Storming, The Connected Company, and the latest one being Liminal Thinking.
Yes.
Please go out and buy those books and read them. So thanks a lot, Dave, for taking time and talking to us today.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kash.